The Duke of Blackwood came home to a castle of unnerving perfection. After 3 months in London, navigating the suffocating intricacies of Parliament and the even more suffocating drawing rooms of Mayfair, Alistair had expected to return to the familiar, comfortable disarray of a great house in slow, managed decline. Blackwood Castle was meant to be a place of dignified shadows and the scent of old stone, a place whose grandeur was softened by the patina of age and the realities of a strained inheritance. Instead, the great doors swung open onto a hall that seemed to hold its breath. The air, usually thick with the smell of wood smoke and beeswax, was crisp, carrying only the faintest trace of lavender and rain-washed air. The flagstones, once worn to a soft gray, shone with a low, deep luster, reflecting the weak afternoon light from the high mullioned windows. Every surface was polished to a gleam. Every tapestry hung straight and true, their colors seeming somehow brighter, as if a layer of dust he had never even noticed had been lifted. It was not welcoming. It was immaculate. It was silent. His boots made a sharp, intrusive echo as he crossed the hall. No shuffling footsteps from the butler. No distant clatter from the kitchens. No scurry of a maid disappearing around a corner. He had sent word of his arrival, of course, but the profound stillness felt less like anticipation and more like absence. "Mrs. Gable," he called out, his voice sounding too loud in the cavernous space. The housekeeper, a woman who had been a fixture of the castle since his own childhood, typically materialized from the shadows with a quiet cough and a report. Silence answered him. A deep, resonant silence that seemed to soak into the very stones of the castle. A flicker of irritation, sharp and unwelcome, pricked at him. He was the Duke. His return was not a minor event. He moved from the hall into the long gallery, his eyes scanning the portraits of his ancestors. They stared down at him, their painted expressions impassive, yet he felt a novel sense of being judged. The gallery, too, was pristine. The silver frames of the miniatures gleamed. The long oak table that ran down its center, usually a repository for books, maps, and discarded gloves, was bare save for a single large vase of white roses, their petals so perfect they seemed carved from alabaster. He walked the length of the gallery, his sense of unease solidifying into a cold knot in his stomach. This was not the work of a merely efficient staff. This was the work of a house being held in stasis. A house that was waiting for something, or someone, that was not him. He passed the drawing room, the door slightly ajar. The furniture was arranged with geometric precision. The fire was laid in the grate, but unlit. No sherry decanter left out. No half-read book left open on a side table. It was a room in a museum, not a room to be lived in. His steps quickened as he mounted the grand staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. His own chambers. Surely there he would find some sign of life, of normalcy. He pushed open the heavy oak door. The room was cool and smelled of clean linen. His valet was not there. A fresh change of clothes was laid out on the bed, the cambric of the shirt impossibly white, the wool of his coat brushed to a perfect nap. But the room was empty, cold. And then he saw her rooms. The connecting door to the Duchess's suite, a door that was, by unspoken agreement, always kept closed, now stood a few inches open. He hesitated for only a second before pushing it wider. Her rooms were as immaculate as the rest of the castle, but they were also stripped bare. The silver-backed brushes and combs were gone from the dressing table. The small, worn volume of poetry she kept by her bedside had vanished. The wardrobe doors were ajar, revealing a stark emptiness within. The only scent in the air was the lingering ghost of the jasmine soap she favored, a scent that now seemed like a memory. He felt a sudden, sharp intake of breath, as if the air had been punched from his lungs. He turned back to his own study, a room that was his sanctuary, his fortress. He expected chaos there, the familiar, managed clutter of his own life, but it too was ordered. His desk was cleared of all its usual sediment of letters, bills, and parliamentary reports. In the precise center of the vast, polished expanse of mahogany sat two objects. One was a large, leather-bound ledger, its cover worn smooth from use. The other was a single folded sheet of cream-colored paper resting directly on top of it. His name was written on the outside in a fine, clear hand he knew as well as his own, though he had rarely seen it on personal correspondence addressed to him. His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood. With a hand that felt strangely disconnected from his body, he reached out and picked up the letter. The paper was cool, heavy. He unfolded it. The words within were as neat and as spare as the room around him. Your Grace, my work at Blackwood is now complete. The enclosed ledger will show the estate accounts to be solvent, the debts settled, and a modest surplus secured for the coming year. The tenants' contracts have been renegotiated to our mutual benefit, and the home farm is, for the first time in a decade, profitable. The restoration of the West Wing is fully funded and may proceed at your discretion. I have, I believe, fulfilled my side of our bargain. The dowry I brought to this marriage has been repaid, with interest, through my management. As the purpose of my presence here is concluded, I have taken my leave. My personal effects have been sent on to my cousin's house in Bath. I wish you well. Althea, Duchess of Blackwood. He read it once, then a second time. The words did not change. They remained as cool and as final as a line of figures in an account book. He looked at the ledger beneath where the letter had lain. He did not need to open it. He knew, with a certainty that was both chilling and absolute, that every word of her letter was true. He had come home to a perfect castle, a solvent estate, a life set in perfect order. And it was utterly, irrevocably empty. The silence was no longer unnerving. It was an accusation. It was the sound of a life that had been lived beside his, a life he had never bothered to notice, quietly and efficiently packing itself up and vanishing. He stood alone in the center of his vast, silent, perfect world, the letter a weightless, crushing burden in his hand. And for the first time since he was a boy, Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, did not know what to do. 6 months earlier, the Duchess of Blackwood had been standing in the shadows of a different room, a ballroom choked with the scent of wilting flowers and expensive perfume. It was the annual Blackwood Ball, the pinnacle of the local social calendar, an event Althea now organized with the same detached efficiency she applied to the running of the household. She had ensured the champagne was chilled, the musicians were sober, and the Dowager Duchess's favorite ferns had been placed just so to hide a small patch of water-damaged silk on the wall. From her vantage point near a service door, she could observe the glittering assembly, a swirling kaleidoscope of silk, jewels, and self-importance. She was, as always, invisible. As the Duchess, she was a focal point of formal greetings, a recipient of stiff curtsies and polite, meaningless inquiries. But as a person, she did not exist. She was a placeholder in a costume, the quiet, brown-haired woman who had appeared 2 years ago with a fortune sufficient to stop the slow bleeding of the Blackwood estate. Her husband, the Duke, was a constellation. She was the dark matter around which he glittered, unseen, but structurally necessary. He was dancing with Lady Beatrice Finchley, a woman of impossible blondness and effortless grace. Althea watched them, not with jealousy, that required a hope she had long since abandoned, but with the dispassionate eye of a naturalist observing a particularly fine pair of birds of paradise. They moved together with a familiarity that spoke of shared histories, of summers at the same country houses, of a world to which Althea would forever be a foreigner. He smiled down at Lady Beatrice, a rare, unguarded smile that softened the hard lines of his face. Althea had never been the recipient of such a smile. Their interactions were unfailingly courteous, meticulously correct, and as cold as the marble in the hall. A minor crisis with the kitchens called her away, a dispute over the precise moment the lobster patties were to be served. She resolved it with her usual quiet authority, her voice never rising, her instructions clear and final. The chef, a temperamental Frenchman, subsided under her calm gaze. As she made her way back to the ballroom through a tapestry-lined corridor that ran behind the main reception rooms, she heard voices from the adjacent card room, the door of which was ajar. One was the sharp, imperious tone of her mother-in-law, the Dowager Duchess. The other was her husband's. "She is managing things adequately, I suppose," the Dowager conceded, her voice dripping with condescension. "The girl has a head for sums, I'll grant her that. But Alistair, she has no life, no presence. She stands in a corner of her own ballroom like a paid companion. People are talking." There was a pause. Althea froze, her hand on the cold stone of the wall. She should move. She should walk away. It was a private conversation. But her feet were rooted to the floor. "Let them talk," Alistair's voice came, low and weary. "Her presence is not what I required of her." "What you required was her dowry," his mother stated, the words like chips of ice. "A distasteful necessity. But the estate is recovering. Surely now you could make more of an effort. It reflects poorly on you, on the family name, to have a duchess who is a cipher." Althea held her breath. She waited for a defense. A mild one, perhaps. A polite rebuttal. "She is shy. She is my wife. Something, anything." The silence stretched, filled only by the distant strains of the orchestra. Then he spoke. His voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. It was the voice he used with his solicitor. "I tolerate her," he said. The dowry was essential. Her father's connections in the city have proven useful. That is the beginning and the end of it. She understands the terms of our arrangement. She does not complain. I tolerate her. The words did not strike her like a blow. A blow has heat, passion. These words were cold, clinical. They were a final accounting, a closing of a ledger. Everything she had done, the quiet hours spent poring over accounts, the careful diplomacy with disgruntled tenants, the endless, thankless task of managing a household on a shoestring budget while maintaining the illusion of ducal splendor. It was all reduced to a transaction she was expected to understand. She was not a wife. She was a long-term investment that had matured. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears were a currency she could not afford to spend. Instead, a profound and terrifying calm settled over her. It was the calm of a surgeon who has just diagnosed a rot that must be cut away. She had been laboring under a misapprehension. She had believed that by being useful, by being competent, by being unimpeachably correct, she might, over time, earn a different kind of regard. Not love, perhaps. She was not so foolish as to hope for that. But respect, acknowledgement, the simple dignity of being seen as a partner in the enterprise of their life. She had been wrong. She was not a partner. She was an employee whose contract had been fulfilled. She turned from the corridor and walked, not back to the ballroom, but up the servants' staircase to her rooms. The music faded behind her. She moved through the silent, sleeping corridors of the castle, a ghost in her own home. In her sitting room, she lit a single candle. The small flame pushed back the darkness, illuminating the worn spine of her botany text, the neat stack of estate correspondence on her writing desk. These were the things that were truly hers. The work, the knowledge. He tolerated her. He had made a bargain, and he believed she had understood its terms. Very well. A bargain has two sides, and it has an end. She sat at her desk, the silk of her ball gown rustling around her. She would not be a tolerated fixture in this man's life. She would not live out her days as a quiet reproach, a walking reminder of a distasteful necessity. She would fulfill her side of the arrangement to the absolute letter. She would not just stop the bleeding of the Blackwood estate. She would heal it. She would make it whole, strong, and prosperous. She would pour every ounce of her intelligence and energy into the task, leaving no room for argument, no opening for criticism. And when it was done, when the final account was settled and the balance paid in full, she would leave. She would not be the Duchess he tolerated. She would be the woman who had saved his legacy and then walked away from it, leaving him in a pristine, perfect, and empty castle. The decision, once made, did not feel like grief. It felt like freedom. The quiet, cold, exhilarating freedom of a debt about to be paid. The morning after the ball, Althea rose not with the sun, but before it. The decision she had made in the lonely hours of the night had not dissolved in the gray light of dawn. It had solidified, settling into her bones as a new kind of certainty. Grief was a luxury, a self-indulgence. What she felt now was purpose. It was a cold, clean fire. She did not go down to breakfast. The formal morning meal with the Duke and his mother was a ritual of polite silence she could no longer endure. Instead, she requested a tray in her study, a small, overlooked room adjacent to the main library that she had quietly claimed as her own. It was crowded with books on crop rotation, animal husbandry, and architectural preservation, their spines cracked, their pages filled with her own neat annotations. This was her true domain. Her first act was to send a note to Mr. Finch, the estate steward. He was a good man, honest and hard-working, but overwhelmed by the scale of the problems he had inherited. He viewed her with a wary respect, accustomed to duchesses who concerned themselves with flower arrangements, not financial ledgers. Mr. Finch, the note read, please bring the complete estate accounts for the past 5 years to my study at 10 o'clock. We will also require the rent rolls and the reports from the tenant farms. I wish to conduct a full audit. She knew this would cause a tremor in the household.
It was a departure from her previous method of quiet suggestion and gentle inquiry. It was an assertion of authority. At precisely 10, a nervous-looking Mr. Finch appeared, followed by 2 footmen laden with heavy, dust-covered books. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "Your Grace," he began, "the Duke has always overseen the audits himself." "The Duke is in London," Althea replied, her voice even. She did not look up from the fresh page of the new ledger she had opened on her desk. "And the estate cannot wait for his intermittent attention. Please, put them on the table." For the next month, the study became her world. She worked with a relentless, monastic focus. She traced every pound, every shilling from its origin to its expenditure. She uncovered decades of mismanagement, of sentimental leases, of debts ignored and assets forgotten.
She found that the home farm was losing money, its fields mismanaged and its livestock poorly chosen. She discovered that a valuable stand of ancient oaks, designated for sale to the Navy, had been consistently undervalued by a timber merchant who was a cousin of the dowager's lady's maid. She did not rage. She made notes. Her handwriting, small and exact, filled page after page. In the afternoons, she rode out, not on the gentle mare she used for polite excursions, but on a sturdy gray gelding from the stables, better suited to muddy tracks and steep hillsides. She visited every tenant farm, from the prosperous sheep farms in the high dales to the struggling barley fields in the lowlands. She did not arrive as the Duchess, expecting deference. She arrived with Mr. Finch, her ledger in her saddlebag, and she listened. She walked the fields, her hem dragging in the dirt. She inspected the barns. She looked at the farmers' account books, her expression unreadable. They were suspicious at first, but she spoke their language, the language of yields, of soil quality, of market prices. She noticed things: a roof in need of repair, a child with a persistent cough, a field that would be better suited to potatoes than wheat. She made no grand promises. She simply observed, recorded, and calculated. Her mother-in-law was appalled. "Alistair must be told," the dowager fumed over dinner one evening, a meal Althea now attended with the same sense of duty she applied to inspecting a drainage ditch. "You are making a spectacle of yourself, hobnobbing with farmers. A duchess does not concern herself with the price of seed." "A duchess whose estate is teetering on the edge of insolvency would be a fool not to," Althea replied calmly, not looking up from her plate. The dowager sputtered, but for the first time there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Althea's competence was becoming its own form of armor, a quiet, unassailable force. Her greatest project, however, was a personal one. At the far end of the formal gardens lay a vast, dilapidated glass house, its panes shattered, its iron frame rusting. It had been built by Alistair's grandfather, a passionate amateur botanist, but had been neglected for 30 years. To Althea, it was a ruin of a shared passion she could never discuss with her husband. It was also a metaphor for the entire estate, a structure of great beauty and potential, left to decay. She hired a local glazier and a blacksmith, paying them not from the dwindling estate funds, but from her own personal allowance, the last remnant of her dowry. She worked alongside them, directing the repairs, her fine lady's hands learning the feel of rust and putty. Slowly, painstakingly, the glass house was reborn. She filled it not with exotic, expensive orchids, but with useful things: herbs for the kitchens, medicinal plants for the village, hardy varietals of vegetables that could be grown year-round to supplement the estate's larders. The conservatory became her sanctuary. In the warm, damp air, surrounded by the scent of earth and growing things, she felt a sense of peace. This, at least, was real. This was hers. She was not a tolerated wife. She was a woman who could make things grow. This quiet, parallel life of competence was her salvation. She was building something, not just for the Duke she would leave behind, but for herself. Each balanced column in the ledger, each mended pane of glass, was a step toward her own liberation. She was not enduring. She was preparing. 2 months into Althea's silent revolution, the Duke came home. His return was unannounced, a brief visit between parliamentary sessions. He arrived late one afternoon, expecting the same quiet, decaying grandeur he had left behind. Instead, he found a subtle but pervasive sense of industry. There was a new efficiency in the way the grooms took his horse, a new crispness in the butler's demeanor. The air in the great hall still smelled of stone and age, but it was overlaid with the scent of fresh paint from a distant wing and the faint, savory aroma of baking bread from the kitchens. He found his mother in the drawing room, her needlepoint abandoned in her lap, a thunderous expression on her face. "Alistair, thank heavens," she began without preamble. "You must speak to your wife. She has taken leave of her senses. She spends her days shut up with the steward or traipsing through muddy fields like a common land agent. She has fired the timber merchant, Mr. Albright, a most reliable man, and she is filling the new gardens with cabbages." Alistair absorbed this tirade with his usual cool detachment. He had received a letter from Mr. Finch the week prior, a letter so full of praise for the Duchess's acumen that he had almost dismissed it as sycophancy. Finch had detailed the renegotiated timber contract with a new merchant, at a price 20% higher than Albright had ever offered. He had mentioned the reorganization of the home farm, the new crop rotations. Alistair had filed it away as an interesting but minor development. His wife had a hobby. It seemed a harmless one. "If the estate is benefiting, Mother, I see little cause for alarm," he said, pouring himself a sherry. "It is unseemly," she insisted. "It is not her place." "Her place," Alistair said, a touch of acid in his tone, "is to be the Duchess of Blackwood. The prosperity of the estate is central to that role. Or have you forgotten why I married her?" The dowager fell silent, chastened. The transactional nature of the marriage was a truth they both acknowledged, but one he rarely voiced so bluntly. He did not seek Althea out. Their relationship was governed by a set of unspoken rules, and seeking her out for conversation was not one of them. He expected to see her at dinner, but at dinner, her place was empty. "Her Grace is taking her meal in the conservatory, Your Grace," the butler informed him when he inquired. "She said she had work to finish." The conservatory? He had not set foot in the place in years. Curiosity, an emotion he rarely felt in relation to his wife, stirred within him. After his solitary meal, he found himself walking through the damp evening gardens, drawn by a soft, golden light emanating from the far end. He saw it from a distance, the long, elegant structure of the glass house, no longer a dark skeleton, but a lantern of glowing panes against the twilight. As he drew closer, he saw her inside. She was not dressed for dinner. She wore a simple, dark dress, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She was standing at a long potting bench, her head bent in concentration, carefully transplanting seedlings from a small tray into larger pots. Her hands, which he had only ever seen resting in her lap or holding a teacup, moved with a deft, practiced grace. The space was filled with rows upon rows of green, living things. The air that drifted out to him was warm and earthy, scented with damp soil and rosemary. It was a world away from the stiff, cold rooms of the castle. It was a world she had built entirely on her own. He stood in the shadows, watching her. He saw not the quiet, unremarkable woman who sat at his dinner table, but a stranger, a woman absorbed, competent, and entirely self-contained. There was a quiet intensity to her focus that he had never witnessed before. She was not performing for an audience. She was simply working. And in that work, there was a dignity, a wholeness, that he found unexpectedly compelling. He should have gone in. He should have said something, praised the restoration, asked about the plants. It would have been the courteous thing to do, but the words felt foreign in his mouth. What could he say? "I see you have been productive in my absence." It sounded condescending. "This is quite a transformation." It sounded inadequate. He was the Duke of Blackwood. He was master of this estate, master of this castle, master of this woman's life, by law and by contract. Yet as he stood there, watching her in the small, warm world she had created, he felt like an intruder. He saw the work, the result, the undeniable improvement, but he could not connect it to the woman. He saw the balanced ledger of her efforts, but he did not, could not, see her. He turned and walked back to the cold, silent house, the image of her in the candlelight imprinted on his mind. It was a puzzle he had no interest in solving. She was doing her duty, as agreed. That was sufficient. He left for London 2 days later, without seeing her again. The Duke's brief, dismissive visit did not deter Althea. It hardened her resolve. His silence on the matter of the conservatory, his failure to acknowledge the manifest changes in the estate's fortunes, was not an insult. It was confirmation. She was a function, a mechanism. The results were all that mattered, not the operator. And so she continued to operate. In the months that followed, her influence deepened, spreading through the estate like the roots of the hardy plants she cultivated. She established a small infirmary in the village, using the herbs and medicinal plants from her conservatory to create salves, tinctures, and teas. The local physician, a weary old man named Dr. Harris, was initially skeptical, but after Althea's willow bark tea proved more effective for fevers than anything he could offer, he became a grudging convert. The tenants began to speak of her not as the Duchess, a remote and lofty title, but as Our Lady, a term of affection and respect she never heard, but which was reported to a furious dowager by her network of gossiping maids. Her work also brought her into contact with Mr. Thorne. He was a botanist from Cambridge, spending the summer in the countryside to catalogue the local flora for a new book. He heard rumors of the restored Blackwood Conservatory and the Duchess's unusual knowledge, and he sent a letter requesting permission to see it. Althea agreed. She met him not in a formal drawing room, but at the door to the glass house itself, her hands smudged with earth. Mr. Thorne was a young man with a scholar's stoop and an enthusiast's bright, curious eyes. He looked at her, then at the thriving plants around them, and his face broke into a smile of pure, unfeigned delight. "Your Grace," he said, his voice full of genuine admiration. "This is magnificent. I was told it was a ruin." "It was," Althea said simply. "I found it had good bones." They spent the entire afternoon together, walking among the rows of green. He did not treat her with the stilted deference she received from others of her station. He spoke to her as a peer. He marveled at her clever system for rainwater collection. He debated the finer points of soil composition with her, and he listened, truly listened, as she explained her experiments in cross-pollinating bean varieties for a hardier crop. "You have a remarkable mind for this, Your Grace," he said,
examining a leaf through his pocket lens. "It is a science, not a hobby, and you practice it with a scholar's rigor. Have you read Abercrombie's treatise on the hothouse cucumber?" "I have," she replied. "I found his conclusions on ventilation to be flawed." Mr. Thorne laughed, a sound of pure academic joy. "So did I. I wrote a paper on it. No one has ever agreed with me. Certainly not a duchess." For the first time in years, Althea felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the humid air of the conservatory. It was the simple, profound pleasure of being understood. Mr. Thorne saw not her title, not her dowry, not her place in the social firmament. He saw her mind. He saw her work and respected it for what it was. His uncomplicated decency was a stark contrast to her husband's cold blindness. He was a looking-glass that showed her not what she was, but what she might have been in a different life.
Meanwhile, the Dowager Duchess's campaign of petty sabotage escalated. Annoyed by the growing esteem in which Althea was held, she began to interfere. She countermanded Althea's instructions to the kitchen staff, insisting on extravagant menus the budget could not support. She invited a stream of expensive houseguests, disrupting the quiet industry of the castle. Her most pointed attack was aimed at the conservatory. Citing a need for more appropriate floral displays for the house, she ordered the head gardener to clear a section of Althea's medicinal herbs to make way for ornamental camellias. The gardener, caught between two powerful women, came to Althea in a state of distress. Althea listened patiently, her expression calm. She did not confront her mother-in-law. A direct conflict was a battle she would lose in the Duke's eyes. It would be seen as a failure of decorum. Instead, she acted. She took a detailed inventory of the herbs the Dowager had ordered destroyed. She calculated the cost of replacing them from an apothecary in York. She then drew up a new, separate budget for the household's decorative needs, accounting for the Dowager's camellias and other whims. She presented this, along with the bill for the destroyed herbs, to the Dowager's personal accountant. "It seems the Dowager's household expenses are now distinct from the estate's maintenance," Althea explained to the bewildered man. "As I am responsible for the estate's solvency, I must ensure its resources are not diverted. Please see that these costs are settled from Her Grace's personal income." It was a masterstroke of passive aggression, executed with the precision of a surgeon. The Dowager was incandescent with rage, but there was nothing she could do. Althea had not been emotional or insubordinate. She had been financially prudent. To complain to her son would be to admit she had been outmaneuvered on grounds of pure logic. News of this, and of Mr. Thorne's frequent visits, eventually reached Alistair in London. His mother's letters were a litany of complaints about the uppity chit and her obsession with weeds. His steward's letters, conversely, were glowing reports of continued success, with a curious new mention of a Mr. Thorne, the botanist from Cambridge, who was proving a valuable consultant to the Duchess. Alistair read these conflicting accounts with a growing sense of dislocation. The woman his mother described, scheming, ambitious, socially improper, bore no resemblance to the quiet, self-effacing figure he had married. And yet, the competent, innovative manager Mr. Finch described also seemed like a stranger. He found himself looking at her signature on a household expense report he was required to approve. The neat, controlled loops of the A in Althea. He had the unsettling feeling that he was married to a woman he did not know at all. The decent, respectful attention of Mr. Thorne, a man of intellect, threw his own neglect into sharper relief, a fact he would never admit
but which lodged in his mind like a splinter. He was the Duke. Her attention belonged to Blackwood. It belonged to him. The thought was as proprietary as it was unwelcome. The crisis, when it came, was not a matter of crops or tenants, but of paper and ink. A letter arrived from a firm of solicitors in London, bearing news that struck at the very heart of the Blackwood legacy. An old debt incurred by Alistair's grandfather to finance a disastrous venture in the West Indies had been bought by a consortium of aggressive investors. The original loan had been secured against a significant portion of the Blackwood lands Althea had just spent months nursing back to health. The investors were now calling in the debt with ruinous interest, giving the Duke 3 months to pay or forfeit the land. The sum was staggering, far beyond the modest surplus Althea had managed to build.
It was a death blow, threatening to undo all her work and plunge the estate back into the darkness from which she had pulled it. Alistair was forced to return from London at once. He arrived not with the casual air of a brief visit, but with the grim focus of a commander facing a siege. He closeted himself in his study for 2 days, surrounded by lawyers and bankers, their hushed, pessimistic voices a constant murmur through the heavy oak door. Althea was not invited to these meetings. She was, once again, relegated to the role of a concerned bystander. The men of business did not think to consult the Duchess, who, in their world, was a decorative creature concerned with menus and correspondence. On the 3rd day, Alistair emerged, his face pale and etched with strain. He had failed. The banks would not extend further credit. His friends in Parliament offered sympathy but no solutions. The consortium was inflexible. The land would be lost. He found Althea in her study, the room where her quiet revolution had begun. She was standing by the window, looking out at the rain-swept parkland, the very land that was to be carved away. The room was, as always, meticulously ordered. On her desk lay the estate ledgers, bound in their worn leather, silent testaments to her labor. "It is over," he said, his voice flat with defeat. He did not mean it as a confession, but as a statement of fact. "There is no way to raise the funds. We will lose the North Riding." Althea turned from the window. Her expression was not one of panic or despair. It was calm, focused, and intensely alert. It was the face of a person who had already been calculating. "Perhaps not," she said quietly. He stared at her. "I have had the best financial minds in London examining the problem. There is no solution. They are looking at your assets, Your Grace," she replied, moving to her desk. "They are not looking at mine." She gestured to a small, locked rosewood box on her desk. It was a beautiful object, a part of the dowry she had brought with her, something he had never paid any mind. She unlocked it with a small silver key she wore on a chain around her neck. Inside, nestled on velvet lining, were papers. Not letters, but stock certificates and deeds. "My father was not a nobleman," she said, her voice even. "He was a merchant. He did not believe in land as the only store of value. He believed in trade, in shipping, in the future. When he died, he left me a portfolio of investments. Canals, the East India Company, municipal bonds. I have managed it myself since I came of age. It is entirely separate from my dowry, entirely my own." She spread the papers on the desk. Alistair looked at them, his eyes widening in disbelief. The neat columns of figures, the names of companies and trading houses. It was a language he understood, but one he had never associated with her. The value represented by the documents was immense. It was more than enough to cover the debt. He was speechless. He had married her for her money, a fact that had always been a source of private shame and public pragmatism. But he had thought he knew the extent of it. He had seen her as the daughter of a rich man, a static source of funds. He had never conceived of her as a financial entity in her own right, an active, intelligent manager of wealth far greater than the dowry that had saved him. "Why?" he finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "Why did you never speak of this?" Althea met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw not a quiet, brown-haired cipher, but the full, unshielded force of her intelligence. Her eyes were clear and cold as winter water. "You never asked," she said. The three simple words landed with the force of a physical blow. He had lived beside this woman for 2 years. He had slept in an adjacent room, eaten at the same table, borne the same name. And he had never asked. He had never thought to look beyond the convenient label he had assigned her, the dowry. Now, in his moment of ultimate defeat, she was revealing a depth and capability he could not have imagined. She held the salvation of his ancestral home in a small wooden box, a power she had kept hidden in plain sight. He saw her then, truly saw her, not as a wife or a duchess or a transaction, but as a formidable, unknown woman whose inner life was a country to which he had never even sought a passport. The realization was as humiliating as it was profound. He had been blind, and his blindness had been a choice. He stood in the middle of her study, the room that was the heart of her secret, competent life, and felt the foundations of his world shift. She was not the one who was diminished. He was. The silence in the study stretched, thick with the weight of unspoken things. Alistair looked from the papers on the desk to Althea's face. The calm, almost distant expression she wore was more unnerving than any tears or recriminations would have been. He felt a desperate, unfamiliar urge to explain, to justify, to bridge the chasm that had just opened at his feet. "Althea," he began, using her given name for the first time in what felt like an eternity. I had no idea. This is extraordinary." "It is merely a matter of assets and liabilities, Your Grace," she replied, her voice cool and precise. She began gathering the papers, her movements economical and sure. "The question is whether we wish to liquidate these holdings to satisfy the debt." The word "we" hung in the air. For 2 years, their lives had been a matter of I and you. The sudden, business-like inclusion of a shared pronoun felt both jarring and, to his surprise, deeply welcome. "It is your property," he said, the words tasting like ash. "I have no right to ask you to sacrifice it for my family's folly." "It is not your family's folly alone," she corrected him gently. "It is the folly of the Blackwood estate, of which I am the Duchess. Its public ruin would be my public ruin. My motive is not charity. It is self-preservation." Her pragmatism was a shield, deflecting any attempt at emotional connection. She was treating him as she would a business partner, and he found he had no standing to demand anything more. For the next week, they worked together. She brought her sharp, clear mind to the problem, directing her own solicitors in London with a fluency that astonished him. He, who was used to giving orders, found himself in the unfamiliar position of being a subordinate, providing her with the documents and historical context she required. He saw her in a new light. He saw the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way she would bite her lip when calculating a complex sum. He noticed the small, efficient gestures of her hands, the way she could locate a specific clause in a dense legal document in moments.
He was not just seeing her competence, he was seeing the woman who possessed it, and he was ashamed. Ashamed of his blindness, of his arrogance, of the colossal failure of imagination that had allowed him to live beside this person and see nothing. Once the arrangements were made and the debt settled, a strange quiet fell between them. The crisis was over. The estate was safe, more secure than it had been in a century. He felt he should be triumphant, or at least relieved. Instead, he felt a profound and aching loss. He had saved his legacy, but he had the distinct sense he was about to lose his wife. Not in the legal sense, but in every way that mattered. He found her in the drawing room one evening, staring into the fire. She was dressed simply, and he realized with a jolt that he had no idea what her favorite color was. "Althea," he said, his voice quiet, "I have not thanked you." She turned to look at him, her face illuminated by the flickering light. "You have, Your Grace. Repeatedly. It is not necessary."
"I did what was required." "No," he said, stepping further into the room. "You did far more than was required. You saved us. And I have been a fool." It was a stark admission, one that cost his pride dearly. He expected it to have an impact. She merely inclined her head slightly. "We are all foolish at times." Her placid acceptance was more damning than any argument. He felt a surge of frustration. He wanted to break through the wall of her composure, to find the woman he now knew must exist behind it. "Why are you like this?" he asked, the question sharper than he intended. "So distant, so controlled. Even now, I am trying to apologize to you." A flicker of something, pain, anger, weariness, crossed her face before being instantly suppressed. She rose from her chair, her posture erect and dignified. "An apology is for a mistake, Your Grace," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet every word was perfectly clear. "What you have offered me for 2 years was not a mistake. It was a policy." He flinched. She was right. His coldness had been a deliberate choice, a shield for his own past wounds. "You don't understand," he began, a pathetic defense. "Oh, but I do," she interrupted, and now her voice was not cold, but filled with a quiet, devastating finality. "I understand perfectly. I have for 6 months. I was there at the ball in May, in the corridor behind the card room. I heard you speaking with your mother." The color drained from his face. He remembered the moment with sickening clarity. The stuffy room, his mother's goading, his own weary, dismissive words. "I tolerate her. The dowry was essential. That is the beginning and the end of it." He felt as if the floor had dropped away. Every moment of the past 6 months clicked into place. Her sudden, fierce dedication to the estate, her cool distance, her self-containment. It had not been a hobby. It had been a project with a deadline. "Althea," he whispered, his voice cracking. There is nothing more to be said," she stated, her composure absolute. "I have fulfilled my bargain. The estate is solvent. The ledgers are balanced. I have honored my part of the arrangement you described so clearly." She took a small, steadying breath. "And now my part is done. I shall be leaving for Bath at the end of the week." It was the same sentiment from the letter he would one day find, but hearing it spoken aloud, in this quiet room, with the weight of his own damning words behind it, was infinitely worse. It was a judgment, a closing of the books on their life together. He had treated her as a transaction, and she had meticulously, brilliantly fulfilled its terms. And now she was closing the account. He stared at her, the woman he had finally begun to see, and realized he was about to lose her completely. Not through malice or betrayal, but through his own stupid, prideful, calculated neglect. The house was safe. The name was secure. And his world was about to become an empty, echoing ruin. Greetings, gentle viewers. If this story of quiet strength and belated sight is resonating with you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing these narratives to life. Now, let us return to Blackwood Castle and the Duke's reckoning. Alistair felt a cold dread seep into him, a feeling far worse than the fear of financial ruin. That had been a problem of numbers, of assets. This was a problem of the soul, and he knew with sickening certainty that he was bankrupt. Leaving, he repeated, the word hollow. That is not possible. You are the Duchess of Blackwood. It is a title I can hold from a distance, Althea replied, her voice devoid of emotion. We can come to a private arrangement, a quiet separation. The world need only know that I prefer the climate in Bath for my health.
It is done all the time.
She was speaking of the end of their marriage as if she were planning a journey, with the same cool logistics she applied to everything. He could not bear it. I do not want an arrangement, he said, his voice raw. I do not want you to go. Why not? She asked, a genuine, piercing question. My purpose here is fulfilled. The estate no longer requires my fortune or my management, and you, Your Grace, will no longer be required to tolerate me. The word, his word, was a stiletto in his gut. He flinched visibly. For the first time, he saw a crack in her composure, a glint of long-held pain in her eyes before it was veiled again. That was, he started, then stopped. What could he say? That he hadn't meant it? He had. That it was a lie? It wasn't. It had been the truth of his heart at that moment, a cold, withered and pathetic truth. He had to find a different one. That was the word of a fool, he said, his voice low and intense. A bitter, proud fool who had been hurt once and decided to build a fortress around himself and call it principle. I was betrayed a long time ago, before I met you, by a woman I thought I loved. She chose a wealthier title over me. I made a vow then that I would never again be vulnerable in that way. When my father died and left the estate in ruins, I saw marriage not as a partnership, but as the only viable financial solution. I saw you, he swallowed, the confession sticking in his throat. I saw you as that solution, and I treated you as such. It was a monstrous injustice, and I am sorry. He finally said it. The words felt inadequate, flimsy against the granite of her resolve. She listened, her head tilted slightly, her expression unreadable in the firelight. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment. I am sorry for your past wound, Your Grace, she said, her voice softer now, but still distant. I am. But your wound does not give you leave to wound others. You built a fortress, yes, but you demanded I live in its shadow. An apology is a fine thing, but it does not change the fact that for 2 years you looked at me and saw nothing but a line in a ledger. She was right. Words were not enough. They were air. He had built his world on actions, on transactions, on tangible results. He had to offer her the same. The next morning, he did not argue with her further. He did not plead. He acted. He went first to his mother's rooms. The dowager was already composing a triumphant letter, assuming Althea's imminent departure was a victory. "Mother," Alistair said, his voice leaving no room for debate, "you will apologize to the Duchess. You will thank her for saving this family from ruin, and you will henceforth treat her with the respect she is owed. If you find you cannot do that, your own dower house is in perfect repair. You may remove to it at your convenience." The dowager's jaw dropped. She stared at her son as if he were a stranger. She saw in his eyes a new and unbending resolve. Next, he summoned Mr. Finch. Together, they rode out to the North Riding, the lands that had been saved. He convened the tenants, men whose families had worked this land for centuries. "I want you to know," Alistair announced, his voice carrying across the damp fields, "that this land, your homes, your futures, were saved by one person. Not by me, but by the Duchess. Her intelligence, her foresight, and her personal generosity are the only reasons we are not all ruined today. The improvements you have seen on this estate are her work. Blackwood thrives because of her." The news rippled through the crowd, murmurs of surprise and respect. It was a public abdication of his own pride, a direct and unequivocal tribute. He was giving her the one thing he had always withheld: public acknowledgement. He was making her visible. But his most important act was a private one. That evening, he went to the conservatory. She was there, as he knew she would be, quietly tending her plants. The air was warm and thick with the scent of loam and night-blooming jasmine. He did not speak at first. He simply stood in the doorway, watching her. Then he walked not to her, but to a small, cluttered workbench in the corner. He had seen it there before, her worn copy of Gerard's El Bal, its spine broken, its pages filled with her notes. Beside it lay Mr. Thorne's new book on local flora. He picked up the latter. "Mr. Thorne seems a very knowledgeable man," he said quietly. Althea looked up, surprised. "He is," she said, her tone guarded. "He is also a fortunate one," Alistair continued, turning the book over in his hands. "He has had the pleasure of your conversation on a subject you love, a pleasure I denied myself." He put the book down and picked up the old El Bal. He opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. It was a section on willow trees, and in the margins, in her neat, precise hand, was a series of observations on the properties of the bark. "I read this last night," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "After you had gone to your room, I read all your notes. About the willow bark for fevers, about using nettles to improve the soil, about the fungi on the fallen beaches. I sat in your study, and for the first time, I did not see an account book. I saw a mind, a brilliant, curious, passionate mind. And I realized..." His voice broke for a moment. He cleared his throat. "I realized that the greatest asset you brought to this marriage was not your dowry. It was you. And I was too blind and too proud to see it." He looked at her then, his heart in his eyes. "I cannot erase the last 2 years. I cannot unsay the words you heard. but I can promise you a different future. Not as a bargain or a policy, but as a choice." He took a step toward her. "Stay, Althea. Not for the estate, not for the title, not because you are my wife-in-law. Stay for me. Stay and let me learn you. Let me earn the right to stand with you in this garden. Or, if you choose to go, I will understand. The choice is yours, entirely and without condition. For the first time, it is truly yours." He stood before her, stripped of all his ducal arrogance, all his pride. He was not making a demand, he was making a plea. He had finally given her the one thing she had never had, the freedom to leave him. And he waited, holding his breath, praying she would choose to stay. Althea looked at him, and in the warm, fragrant air of the world she had built, she saw not the cold, distant duke she had married, but a man humbled, broken, and trying to piece himself back together into someone worthy of her. She saw the truth of his confession, not in his words, but in his actions. The public declaration to the tenants, the confrontation with his mother, and now this, the quiet, profound gesture of having taken the time to read her notes, to enter her world, to see her mind. He had apologized for his blindness, and then he had proven he could now see. Her composure, the shield she had held up for so long, finally dissolved. A single tear traced a path through the faint smudge of dirt on her cheek. It was not a tear of grief, but of release. "You read my notes on fungi?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. It was a ridiculous question, a practical detail in the face of monumental emotion, and it was so perfectly her. He let out a shaky breath, a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Every last one," he said. "I confess, I found the section on slime molds rather challenging." The small, shared moment of humor broke the last of the tension. It was an anchor in the storm, a sign that a new language was possible between them. She did not give him her answer then. She simply nodded, a slow, thoughtful gesture. She needed to believe this was real, not just a reaction to the shock of her departure. For the rest of the week, he did not press her. He gave her space, but he was present in a way he had never been before. He appeared at the conservatory not with demands, but with a cup of tea. He asked Mr. Finch to bring the estate reports to them in the library, positioning her as his partner in front of the staff. He listened. He simply, quietly listened. On the day she was meant to depart, her trunks stood packed in the hall. The carriage was waiting. The dowager remained shut in her rooms, a sulking but defeated force. Alistair stood at the bottom of the grand staircase, his face pale but resolute. He had made his case. He would not imprison her with pleas. He would let her go if she chose it. Althea descended the stairs. She was dressed for travel. Her hand rested on the polished oak of the banister. She reached the bottom step and stopped before him. The entire castle seemed to be holding its breath. "The climate in Bath," she said, her voice clear and steady in the silent hall, "is said to be excellent for one's health." Alistair's heart plummeted. He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He had lost. "However," she continued, a small, true smile finally reaching her eyes, "I find that my work here is not quite as complete as I had imagined. The slime molds in the West Woods proving unexpectedly fascinating. I should like to study them further. Relief washed over him so powerfully he felt his knees might buckle. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently took hers. Her fingers curled around his. It was the first time they had touched, not as a formality, but as a connection. "I would be honored," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "to learn about them with you." She did not leave. The carriage was sent away, the trunks were taken back upstairs, and that evening, for the first time, the connecting door between their chambers was left open, not by accident, but by choice. The healing would be slow. Trust, once so thoroughly broken, had to be rebuilt piece by piece, like the panes of glass in her conservatory. But for the first time, the foundation was solid. It was built not on a bargain of fortunes, but on the shared ground of two people who had finally, truly, seen one another. 5 years later, the silence in Blackwood Castle was a distant memory. It had been replaced by a new symphony of sounds, the cheerful clatter from the kitchens, the distant laughter of grooms in the stable yard, and, most notably, the pitter-patter of small running feet on the once gleaming flagstones of the great hall. One crisp autumn afternoon, Alistair stood in the conservatory, which was now twice its original size and a riot of organized life. He was watching his wife and his son. Althea was kneeling in the dirt, her dark hair pinned up loosely, showing a 4-year-old boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's serious eyes, the delicate structure of a fern frond. "You see, Leo," she was saying, her voice full of the same quiet passion he had first witnessed from the shadows all those years ago. "Each one of these tiny leaves is a perfect copy of the whole. It's a pattern." Leo touched the frond with a chubby finger, his expression one of intense concentration. "A pattern," he repeated solemnly. Alistair smiled. He no longer felt like an intruder in this space. It was the heart of their home, the heart of their life together. The long potting benches were still there, but now they held his own clumsy attempts at grafting apple trees alongside her masterful botanical experiments. Her worn copy of Gerard's Herbal now sat on a shelf next to his well-thumbed books on architecture and history. Their minds, once so separate, now intertwined. The Dowager Duchess had retired to her dower house within a year, unable to cede her position with grace. Her absence had lifted a subtle weight from the castle's atmosphere. Mr. Thorne was now a professor at Cambridge, a dear friend who visited every summer, and was Leo's beloved godfather. Alistair walked over to his wife and son, crouching down to join them. He put his arm around Althea, and she leaned into him with the easy, unconscious comfort of long-established love. He was still the Duke of Blackwood, and she the Duchess. But those were just titles. Here, in the warm, sun-drenched air, they were simply Alistair and Althea. A man who had learned to see, and the woman who had taught him how. He looked at the ledger of his life, no longer written in cold, hard figures, but in the rich, vibrant colors of the world she had built and invited him into. The account was more than solvent. It was overflowing. He had come home once to a perfect empty castle and found a letter that had shattered his world. Now he was home, in a gloriously imperfect, wonderfully full house, with the author of that letter in his arms. And he knew, with a certainty that was the bedrock of his soul, that his life had only truly begun, the day she had chosen not to leave.